The frontier had learned his name the hard way. It rode on the wind across the plains, clung to the dust on saloon floors, and echoed in the hush that fell whenever he stepped through swinging doors. He was the cowboy who never lost, never a gunfight, never a wager, never his nerve. Men twice his size backed away from his shadow, and those foolish enough to challenge him were remembered only by the crosses that followed. He wore confidence like a second skin, slow-moving and unbothered, as if the world itself would eventually bend out of his path. Out here, reputation was currency, and has bought him silence, fear, and obedience. He truly believed that no force on the frontier could make him yield. The town of Red Hollow had been warned before he arrived. Word traveled faster than horses ever could. By the time his boots hit the boardwalk, windows were already shuddering, conversations dissolving into murmurs. He noticed, of course, he always did, the way men stiffened, the way women looked away, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath. This was familiar ground, and he walked it like a king surveying land that already belonged to him. He intended to pass through, collect what he was owed, and leave nothing behind but memory and fear. That was the way of things. That was the way it had always been. Then he heard her voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the street like a blade drawn clean and sure, calm, unapologetic, unafraid. He turned slowly, irritation already rising, expecting a fool or a drunk or someone who didn't yet understand the rules of survival. What he saw instead stopped him cold. She stood at the edge of the crowd, shoulders squared, eyes steady, refusing to step aside. Dust clung to her boots. A rifle rested easy against her arm, and there was no hesitation in her posture, only resolve. The frontier woman who met his stare did not flinch, did not bow her head, did not move out of his way. For the first time in years, the cowboy felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his certainty. They said she had been raised by the land itself, that she learned to ride before she learned to read, to shoot before she learned to sew, while others spoke of her in whispers. She lived openly, fiercely, bound to no man's rule and no town's expectations. She ran her own land, protected her own people, and answered threats with action, not fear. Where the frontier tried to tame her, she pushed back harder, carving out a life that belonged solely to her. She had buried kin, survived storms, and faced down men who believed her independence was an insult to their authority. Each time she stood taller, the cowboy studied her the way he studied opponents, measuring, calculating, searching for weakness. He found none. Her gaze didn't challenge him, it judged him. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. He had been feared, hated, admired, but never assessed like something that could be weighed and dismissed. The crowd waited for him to act, to assert himself, to restore the order they understood. His hand hovered near his holster, not in threat, but in habit. He had never needed to draw quickly. His reputation did that work for him. She spoke again, steady as stone. She told him this was her town, her land, and that his reputation meant nothing here. Each word landed heavy, deliberate, stripping away the myth he had worn so comfortably. Around them, the silence deepened. This was no reckless confrontation. This was a line drawn with intention. He felt something tighten in his chest, pride, perhaps, or the first crack in it. No one had ever claimed authority over him before. No one had ever dared to say no. He could have ended it then. A movement, a flash, another story whispered across the plains. Instead, he did nothing. He stood there, staring into eyes that mirrored his own stubborn fire, and realized this wasn't a battle that could be won with speed or steel. This woman was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of surrendering, and that made her dangerous, in a way he had never encountered. The town didn't exhale until he stepped back. Just one step, barely noticeable, but it was enough for rumors to take root, enough for disbelief to ripple through the onlookers. The cowboy who never lost had hesitated. The fearless frontier woman had not moved at all. Their standoff ended without blood, but something far more volatile had been ignited. Respect laced with resentment, curiosity sharpened by pride. Two forces colliding, neither willing to yield. That night, the cowboy sat alone, Staring into a whiskey glass he never lifted, his reflection looked unchanged. But he felt different, off balance, unsettled, challenged in a way that no gunfight had ever managed. He replayed the moment again and again, her voice, her stillness, the certainty that she would have stood her ground even if he had drawn. For the first time, he questioned the truth he had lived by, that strength meant dominance, and survival meant making others bow. Across town, the frontier woman cleaned her rifle under lantern light, aware that she had shifted something irreversible. She knew men like him. She knew their kind didn't forget defiance. But she also knew herself, and she had never bowed, not to the land, not to loss, and not to legends wrapped in dust and fear. If the cowboy thought this encounter had ended, he was wrong. It had only begun. The frontier had room for only one truth, and soon, one of them would have to decide what they were willing to lose. Morning came hard over Red Hollow, dragging light across the land like a challenge. The cowboy was already awake. Sleep had avoided him the way men once had, circling, wary, refusing to settle. He rose before the town stirred, stepping outside with the quiet restlessness of someone who no longer trusted stillness. The air was cold, sharp enough to remind him he was alive, and yet it did nothing to steady the unrest beneath his ribs. He had crossed deserts, survived ambushes, buried enemies without hesitation. None of that weighed on him now. What haunted him was a woman who had not flinched. He found himself riding toward the edge of town without quite deciding to. Pride told him to leave. Curiosity told him to stay. Something deeper, something raw and unwelcome pulled him forward. Her land lay just beyond the last weathered fence, stretching wide and unbroken, claimed not by conquest but by care. He noticed it immediately, the fences repaired, the horses well kept, the quiet order of a place defended not by fear, but by resolve. This was no fragile homestead waiting to be taken. This was a stronghold built by someone who understood both the land and herself. She was already there when he arrived, standing in the open, as if she had expected him. There was no rifle in her hands this time, no need for it. Her presence alone was enough. The cowboy slowed his horse, aware that every instinct screamed at him to assert control, to speak first, to reclaim the upper hand. He did none of those things. Instead, he dismounted, boots hitting the earth with a heaviness that surprised him. For the first time in his life, he stood before someone without knowing how the encounter would end. She did not greet him kindly. She did not greet him cruelly. She greeted him honestly. She told him she knew men like him, men who mistook fear for respect, silence for surrender. She said she had buried enough of them to recognize the pattern. Each word stripped him bare, cutting through the legend he had carried for so long. He wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, but the truth landed too close to the bone. She wasn't trying to defeat him. She was daring him to see himself. They worked side by side that day, though neither had planned it. A fence needed mending. A horse needed calming. The land demanded attention the way it always did. The cowboy told himself he stayed out of necessity, out of obligation, out of anything but choice. Yet as hours passed, he found his hands moving in rhythm with hers, his silence matching her focus. She did not instruct him. She did not correct him. She trusted him to know what he was doing, and that trust unsettled him more than suspicion ever could. As the sun climbed higher, the mask he wore began to crack. He spoke of battles without names, towns without faces, victories that felt hollow even as they were won. He did not intend to confess. The words simply fell out, loosened by the rare absence of judgment. She listened without interrupting, without softening the truth. When she spoke, it was not to comfort him, but to challenge him. She told him survival was not the same as living, that power taken was never as strong as power earned, that bending the world did not mean you understood it. The cowboy felt something shift, slow and painful, like a bone setting after years of being broken wrong. He had built himself on never yielding, never needing, never staying long enough to be known. Yet here he was, seen in the clear light of day by a woman who refused to fear him and refused to need him. That terrified him more than any drawn gun, because for the first time, he understood what it would mean to lose not his life, but his illusion of invincibility. When danger finally came, it did not come from between them. It came from outside, Men who had followed his trail arrived with violence in their eyes, expecting chaos, expecting submission. They found neither. They found a frontier woman standing her ground and a cowboy standing beside her, not above, not ahead, but equal. The fight was fierce, brutal, and swift, and when the dust settled, the cowboy realized something irreversible had happened. He had chosen a side, not because he was stronger but because he was changed. The town would remember that day differently. Some would say the cowboy finally met someone faster. Others would say he finally met someone braver. But the truth was quieter and far more dangerous. He met someone who did not need to win to stand tall. Someone who taught him that strength could exist without domination, and that surrender, when chosen, was not weakness but courage. At dawn the next morning, he saddled his horse. The frontier woman watched without stopping him. She had never been the kind to beg or bind. If he left changed. If he stayed, it would be by his own will. He paused, hand resting on the saddle horn, and for once the road ahead did not call louder than the ground beneath his feet. He looked back at her, really looked, and nodded not in farewell, but in recognition. Legends said the cowboy never lost again. They were wrong. He lost something far more valuable than his reputation. He lost the man he had been, and in that loss, he finally found his match, not in firepower or fear, but in a fearless frontier woman who never bowed, and taught him how to stand. The frontier noticed his staying long before he admitted it himself. Days passed, then weeks, and the cowboy's horse remained tied where it had no business remaining. The road still waited, wide and familiar, but it no longer owned him. Each morning he rose with the sun, not because danger demanded it, but because the land did. The rhythm of work replaced the rhythm of violence, and though his hands still bore the scars of old battles, they learned new purpose. He fixed what was broken. He guarded what mattered. He listened more than he spoke. The man who once lived by his shadow now walked in full daylight, uncertain, exposed, and alive in a way he had never been. The frontier woman watched the change without praise or suspicion. She knew better than to rush transformation. The land had taught her patience, how pressure shaped stone not by force, but by time. She did not soften for him, did not shrink to make room. She remained exactly who she had always been, and that, more than anything, kept him honest. He learned quickly that standing beside her meant carrying his own weight, not leaning on her strength. For the first time, he was not the most dangerous thing in the room, and he did not resent it. Yet the past does not release men so easily. Whispers returned, carried by riders who remembered the old legend and demanded its resurrection. There were those who believed his staying was a weakness to be exploited, a betrayal to be punished. The frontier had a way of testing change with blood. Trouble gathered like a storm on the horizon, slow and inevitable, and when it finally came, it came not to challenge the woman but to claim the man she had reshaped. They came at dusk when the sky burned red and the land held its breath, armed, angry, certain that the cowboy they had followed would rise to meet them as he always had. They called his name like a curse, daring him to remember who he was. The old instinct surged fast and violent, clawing its way back to the surface. For a moment, just a moment, he felt the pull of it. The ease of dominance, the clarity of destruction, the comfort of becoming the weapon everyone feared. The frontier woman stepped forward before he could. She did not raise a gun. She did not shout. She spoke plainly, telling them the land was not theirs, the fight unnecessary, the outcome already decided. They laughed. Men like that always did. They had never learned the difference between quiet strength and submission. When the first shot rang out, the choice was no longer theoretical. The cowboy moved not as he once had, fueled by rage or pride, but with purpose sharpened by restraint. The fight was swift, decisive, and merciless where it needed to be. But when it ended, bodies lay wounded, not buried. Guns were disarmed, not glorified. The message was unmistakable. This land would not be taken. This woman would not bow. And this man would no longer be used as a symbol of fear. When the dust settled, he stood among the wreckage of his former life, breathing hard, shaken by the realization that he had won, without becoming what he used to be. That was the true victory. That was the loss that changed everything. The frontier did not sing songs about what happened next. It never did. Legends prefer fire to truth. But those who lived long enough remembered something far rarer than bloodshed. They remembered the cowboy who chose to stay, who laid his reputation down like a weapon he no longer needed, who learned that strength could be shared without being diminished. As for the frontier woman, she remained unchanged, and because of that, everything around her changed. Her land prospered. Her people stood taller. Her presence became a marker, a warning, and a promise all at once. She never claimed the cowboy, never named him hers. He stayed because he chose to, because for the first time, standing still required more courage than riding away. Years later, travelers would ask what finally broke the cowboy who never lost. Those who knew the truth would shake their heads and smile quietly. He wasn't broken. He was met by a fearless frontier woman who never bowed. And in meeting her, he learned that the greatest legends are not forged in conquest but in the moment a man decides who he will be when no one is forcing him to choose. Time did what guns never could. It settled the land into something steadier. Seasons turned, carving their marks into the earth and into the people who stayed. The cowboy aged in ways that surprised him, not weaker, not slower, but deeper. Lines traced his face where certainty once lived alone. His hands, once defined by violence, now bore the honest wear of work done daily and done well. He no longer woke expecting trouble. Yet he remained ready for it, not because he feared losing control, but because he understood responsibility. The frontier woman continued as she always had, unbending, watchful, rooted. She did not soften with time, but she grew broader somehow, her presence stretching beyond her land into the lives that gathered around it. People came not for protection alone, but for example. She never called herself a leader, yet others followed her without being asked. The cowboy noticed that difference. He had once commanded rooms through fear. She shaped futures through steadiness. One took obedience, the other earned loyalty. They did not become a storybook ending. There were no promises spoken aloud, no claims made. What grew between them was quieter and far stronger, a shared understanding forged in choice rather than need. They stood together not because the world forced them to, but because standing apart no longer made sense. In that space between independence and unity, something rare took root. Respect without ownership, strength without dominance. Trouble still came, as it always does on the frontier. But it came differently now, smaller, smarter, testing instead of charging. The cowboy handled it with a calm that unsettled those expecting the old legend. He no longer sought to end threats with spectacle. He ended them with clarity, a word when possible, action when necessary. And when violence could not be avoided, it was precise, final, and uncelebrated. What surprised everyone, including himself, was how others stepped forward beside him. Men and women who had learned from watching the frontier woman stand firm. People who no longer waited for a legend to save them. The cowboy understood then that his greatest act had not been staying, or fighting differently, or laying down his reputation. It had been allowing space for others to grow strong, without his shadow looming over them. One night, as wind rolled low across the plains, he admitted what he had never said aloud. He told her he had once believed fear was the only language the world understood. She did not argue. She simply told him fear was loud, but it was never lasting. What endured, she said, was what people chose when no one was forcing them. The cowboy nodded, knowing that truth had cost him everything he once thought made him powerful and had given him far more in return. When the end finally came for the cowboy, it did not arrive in a blaze of gunfire. It came quietly, with a failing body and a steady mind. He faced it the same way he had learned to face everything else, with honesty. He did not ask the frontier woman to change, did not ask her to stay at his side. He already knew she would, not because she belonged to him but because she chose to. After he was gone, the land did not crumble. That was the proof of it all. The fences stood, the people remained, the work continued. His name faded into something less sharp, less feared, but far more respected. Stories changed. Children heard not of the cowboy who never lost, but of the man who learned when to stop fighting the world. And the frontier woman? She stood as she always hadn't bowed. She carried the past without being owned by it. When travelers asked about the legend who stayed, She told them the truth in simple words. He wasn't conquered. He wasn't saved. He was changed by choice, by challenge, by a moment when he met someone who refused to bend. The frontier remembers that kind of story. Longest, not because it is loud but because it is true.